So I'm Sarah Mana, a professor in the Geological Sciences department, and it is a great pleasure to introduce my friend Kat Beck. Kat and I were PhD students together at Rutgers University. She is originally from New Hampshire, got her bachelor at Tufts, and then went to Rutgers for her master in science and PhD. She is currently an associate professor and chair at Hamilton College, and the recipient of a couple of big research grants, including a multi-million-dollar project studying the Miocene in Turkana from the National Science Foundation. And today she's going to talk to us about reconstructing past environments, in what condition did our ancestors survive and thrive. I guess I should have read the title before to be more prepared. This talk is sponsored by the Geological Sciences department. Kat, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be back in the Northeast and in New England. And so, oops, sorry. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which the fields of paleoanthropology and geologic sciences come together. And so that work has taken me all over the globe, but right now I'm doing a lot of work in Eastern Africa, where I'm looking at the interplay between the ways in which climate, tectonics, and volcanism all come together to shape human ancestors. And so I'm going to kind of highlight one particular case study, and I wanted to kind of start things off with a bit of a challenge, right? Like, why is this work so important? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And particularly, since this is the Darwin Festival, thinking back to Darwin as one of these first people who kind of posited the hypothesis that maybe there's some connection between environmental change and the way we are as organisms, whether that's looking at other animals or also looking at ourselves. There we go. And let me see if I can move this around. Does this move? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So one of the big challenges that we face as a scientific community is the fact that oftentimes when we think about paleoclimate, when we think about past climate, the folks who are really leading the charge in that field are focused on the marine realm. They're focused on records from the oceans. And so on this map here, you see in these red circles, you see these are some of the key paleoclimate records that we use to contextualize and think about climate change in tropical latitudes around the continent of Africa. In the yellow diamonds, you see a lot of famous paleoanthropological sites spanning a whole range of time, a whole host of different evolutionary milestones that are recorded in a sedimentary and a rock record. Now, it looks like, say, record 231 and the site of Hadar, which is where the famous fossil Lucy comes from, are quite close together. But in reality, when we look at a map and we actually measure those distances, they're quite far apart. And so then the question is, is using all of this data, this really rich data from all around the continent of Africa, sufficient for understanding what's happening on the continent in terms of climate? And when you look at a map like this, it becomes pretty apparent that the continent is extremely heterogeneous, right? There are areas that are dry, extremely dry, like the Sahara up in the north. And then there's this transitional Sahel. And then we get into areas that are extremely wet, like the tropical rainforest right on the equator. And I'm going to be specifically speaking about this location in the box here, which is the Turkana Basin. And you're seeing modern Lake Turkana highlighted here. But when we think about how much variability occurs in a transect from, say, the Atlantic Ocean across to a place like Turkana, we realize that no, this is not enough to have simply ocean records and apply what we're seeing in the oceans to the environment in which ancestors are evolving in the past. And so with that kind of resolve in mind, a group of people came together and formed the Hominid Sites in Paleolakes drilling project. And this was an international collaboration of geoscientists and paleoanthropologists, paleoclimatologists, ecologists, who all kind of shared this goal of trying to derive climate records from locations much closer to where the fossils were found. Ideally, right, we'd have a beautiful complete skeleton of a hominid and then a beautiful complete multi-million-year-old record of climate right in the same place. Now, we're never going to get that perfectly, but what this project sought to do was take a series of different time slices or little windows in time and couple them with key archaeological and paleoanthropological sites to better understand the climate. So again, this is going to be the focus of my talk, this particular project, but then I also want to kind of give a little bit more context because this will be this one data point, specifically this West Turkana Plio-Pleistocene site, which spans from about 2 million years ago to about 1.5 million years. And this is a really important interval of time because we see the appearance of genus Homo, so things that look like us, things that we are directly derived from. So before I really get rolling, I just wanted to make some acknowledgments. This is part of a huge team that I actually became involved in as a graduate student. So I had the chance to really grow in my scientific community due to many of the individuals here and listed in this slide. So to give you the roadmap, here's where we're headed. I want to start with the why, right? I've given you a little bit of a taste for why we need a terrestrial record, but I want to talk about Turkana specifically. And then how did we get this record? What did we do? What were the archives that we were working with? That will lead us to the what. What did we find? And ultimately, my favorite part, the so what. Why does all this matter? Why did we sink all this time and energy into doing this science? How does it benefit us as humans, as people who want to know about the origins of who we are and where we came from? All right, so here, again, I want to zoom into this Turkana Basin. You see the outline of modern Lake Turkana here, and then it's expanded here. And these areas in yellow are showing you some kind of key locations where fossils have been found. Those are the really fossiliferous sediments in this location. And this purple dot is showing you the site of our drill core. So in 2013, this is kind of where we went. And there are a couple of reasons why we went here. As I mentioned this hominid story, but the Turkana Basin is a really unique location because it records evolutions on multiple scales. Now, oftentimes, especially for those of you who are biology inclined, when you think of evolution, you're thinking of kind of like modification through descent. But as a geoscientist, I think of evolution as change through time. So I'm trying to document things that are changing. And that thing that could be changing could be climate, it could be environment, and it could be the biota as well. All of those are coming together here in Turkana. The first thing that's changing through time is we have actually rifting, plate tectonic activity, tearing a continent apart and creating what's known as the East African Rift System. It's one of the only active continental rifts in the world. So if you want to know about how continents split apart, how oceans are formed, this is a great place to study that evolution. The next thing is kind of thinking about faunal ecosystems. And this is actually one of the places where we see the advent of the modern faunal community. Now, this is going to occur in the Miocene time, so before kind of this story that I'm going to tell takes place. But we see all the things you think of, the lions, the giraffes, the wildebeest, the crocodiles, all of those things have their ancestry, and the fossils are preserved in Turkana. And then finally, bringing it closest to home, right? We see the origins of ourselves as a species, the origins of Homo as a genus, and we see the earliest stone tools. These are not a picture of those stone tools. They're much less charismatic than these. They look kind of just like big rocks with some edges chipped off. But we see the origin of stone tools. The oldest dated tools are 3.3 million years old, and they're from the Turkana Basin. This is a great example of a more modern stone tool technology. But what's really cool is we have all of these different technologies changing through time preserved in this record. And then finally, we come to this character right here, who's known as Nariokotome boy or Turkana boy. And this is one of the most complete Homo erectus fossils ever found. You can see that we can see a lot of details about this individual because of the number of bones that we have. And we've learned fascinating things about this individual's life. They were probably, it's a young boy, it's somewhere in the age of 7 to 11 years old, who actually had some physical deformities. So there's then a suggestion that this individual might have been receiving care, and there may have been some kind of connections here helping to support this individual. And Turkana boy is located less than 3 kilometers, so less than 2 miles from where we drilled this core. So we had the opportunity to, again, as promised, directly tie into that fossil record. We also had the opportunity to look at outcrops, so exposures of rocks and sediments at the surface, which are a great way to kind of take what had previously been done and integrate it into this new work that we were developing through scientific drilling and coring. So here's an example of one of these outcrops, and outcrops are fantastic. Those of you who are studying geology, you probably had the experience of being able to walk up to an outcrop, put your hands on the rock, trace things along laterally so we can see where things change. Maybe we can see the transition from, oh, here's a river channel, and then suddenly that sand disappears, and now I'm in a soil of the floodplain. So we can trace things laterally through space. And obviously, this is oftentimes where those archaeological and paleoanthropological investigations are taking place. But the thing we're lacking here is that's 1 meter high, right? So in terms of time, we have very little preserved here, maybe only a couple thousand years in this particular location. And we know that evolution occurs on really long timescales. So there's a disconnect then. If we want to study evolution, we can't study evolution just from this narrow time slice alone. We need temporal resolution. And that's where cores come in. And the final thing I wanted to point out in this outcrop is you can see some kind of changes, right? Like there's a little bit of a rusty color here, and there's some greenish colors there. But we often, when we work in outcrops, because they're at the modern surface, we have to contend with modern weathering. And so we're facing the challenge of what is an old soil structure and what is a kind of a modern soil structure, and how do we tease those apart? So in comes scientific drill cores, and these are cores of essentially that exact same interval that you just saw in outcrop. But now notice we have an unprecedented scale of resolution in terms of what we can see. So we have a relatively a tool that hadn't really been applied in continental African records, particularly on land, that optimizes this idea of temporal, gives us a long time record, and yields records that are less weathered and allowing us to see things on whole new scales that were previously completely inaccessible from outcrop. All right, so to summarize then kind of this, what we went in to do is we wanted this window of time into this particular location, which is, okay, so this is modern Lake Turkana. And during the time period that we were targeting, we actually had another lake in this basin, Paleolake Lorenyang, which is significantly larger than the modern outline of the lake that you see here in black. And so we employed all of these tools, dating, stratigraphy and sedimentology, accessing paleoecological records through different proxies, and extracting paleoclimate from a lot of that, and then ultimately applying that to paleoanthropology. So now I'm going to take you through the how. How did we do all these things? Oh, there's Kaitio. So that's our drill core. So again, notice based on what we know about the reconstruction of the lake itself, we can see that this record's right on the edge of this very large lake system. And lakes are great because they're kind of just big. I always talk about the cereal bowl analogy. It's like a big cereal bowl, right? You go to a dining hall, or you stumble out of bed in the morning, and if you want to accumulate things, you're going to take a bowl because you can just pour sediment, or cereal in this case, into it, and it's going to accumulate. It's going to stay in that bowl. And so lakes do just that. Now, you would never take that bowl and flip it upside down and pour cereal onto it, right? That's your mountain. That cereal's just going to shed off to the side, and we're never going to see what cereals you chose that day. And so by targeting a lake, we have this continuous sedimentation, and we hope to have a record that has minimal interruption due to erosion. So again, in 2013, we took this big drill rig out here, contended with some very sandy roads, which you can see right here, and we began coring. And ultimately, after about a month of coring time, we came away with 216 meters, so half the lap of a track of sediment with about 95% recovery, which is really high recovery. We were very excited about this record that we got. And we took this record back to the lab at the University of Minnesota, which is the National Lacustrine or Lake Core Repository. And we split these cores and began to analyze them. Some of the things, like one of the first parts, if you want to understand faunal change, is we need some dates. We need to know where we are in time. And so we employed a number of geochronological techniques. Here I'm highlighting the paleomagnetism record. So this is recording changes in the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. And we have a record, almost like a barcode, of when those changes occurred. So when we see a flip in that magnetic field, we can tie it to certain events, if we know more or less where we should be coming in on this record. And in this case, we did, and we recovered this switch here in the magnetic field, which marks the top of the Olduvai subchron at about 1.78 million years. We also used glass shards. So this area was very volcanically active due to that active rifting, that ripping apart of the continent that I mentioned. And all these volcanoes, when they would erupt, they would blow glass fragments with a geochemical fingerprint. Each of these glass shards has a very unique geochemical signature. And by analyzing individual shards for their geochemistry, we can correlate them to areas where they are dated. So even if we don't have directly datable material, we can use stratigraphy, we can use correlation in order to connect the dots and to create a tephrochronological record. And so when we combined all of these data points together, including one place where we actually could date the sediments or date the ash layer directly, we came away with a number of really nice ties that help us figure out where we are. From oldest to youngest, we're kind of interpreting the base of this core based on something we didn't record, which isn't necessarily the best chronological technique to use. But we know the top of the Olduvai here from paleomagnetism. We had a new date for a new tephra that had never been seen before here. And then we have a number of other ages up near the top. And so we see this plotted here in this time depth plot, where we have depth in the core here and age in thousands of years on the y-axis. And so there's a kind of famous geochronological saying, no dates, no rates. But basically what we're able to do here is create sedimentation rates to understand, again, how rapidly are these sediments being deposited and where might we be. Say I have something at 100 meters depth, and it's not directly dated, where might I be based on what I'm inferring from my sedimentological rates? The sedimentology was one of the main roles that I took within this project. And so here I had just such beautiful material to work with, 216 meters of cores, many of which were super charismatic, such as what you see here. And so I went through all of these cores and logged them using a technique called facies analysis. So I'm looking both at the size of the grains, the shape of the grains, the composition of the grains, and then I'm also looking at the sedimentary structures. Are these, say, laminated, which might indicate a very low energy depositional environment where sediment is raining out of suspension, i.e. a lake? Or am I seeing places where the texture is massive? And in this particular core here, you're seeing these little white blobs. Those are actually what we call pedogenic or soil carbonate nodules. And so this is telling me this lack of fabric plus the presence of carbonate is telling me that this was actually a soil, much like a soil that you might walk across the next time you walk across a field. And sometimes we had units full of fossils. So here you see a whole bunch of little gastropods and bivalves. So we're seeing, oh, okay, this is an environment where these organisms maybe weren't living, but are being concentrated after death. into some kind of assemblage that represents probably high energy reworking, such as on a beach where you might wander around and find like a zone of shells that are all piled together. And then finally, we had some things that were definitely sand. And in these particular intervals, we're oftentimes interpreting, okay, this is probably a river. So we're seeing an interplay then between lakes and the floodplains that might be associated with either lakes or rivers, and sometimes beaches. So these were the types of environments and sort of representative examples of some of what these cores look like. Unfortunately, because of the length of the core, it becomes very hard to actually image this in any kind of meaningful way because it's just a little smushy thing. But I'll make a couple of attempts at that as we continue through. Because basically understanding that fundamental environmental signal is really important for every other kind of fancy geochemical and environmental proxy that you might lay on top of this record. So here in this first column on your left, you're seeing a stratigraphic column. So this is showing the core, the depth in the core, with the white spots being gaps, some of that 5% of the core of the record that we didn't recover. And the x-axis is actually showing you grain size. So areas that are bumped out just a little bit are slightly coarser, silts to sands. And overall, you can see that this core is characterized by a very consistent size of sediment. It's pretty much all silt to silty clay. In this next column over, what you're seeing is the aggregate of all of those detailed facies associations that I kind of assigned to each interval in the core. And what you'll notice here is that suddenly intervals that looked kind of just like, it's just a lot of silts, just some boring, like this is true color. So just some boring green silts actually are lakes and soils and lakes and soils and lakes and soils, back and forth and back and forth. So what used to be just like a lot of silt, big pile, all lake, actually is far more complicated in terms of what the environment it represents. And one of the things that emerged from this analysis were consistent patterns that we saw over and over again. And this one was probably the dominant one, and I termed it lam-scram, laminated to scrambled, which is this association here where you have kind of this scrambled unit down here. Again, pretty massive, but it's the way it's breaking apart is analogous to what we see in modern and ancient soils, which are the PED structures. So these little surfaces in these particular soils, we're in an area where it's seasonally wet and dry because we're in this savanna ecosystem with monsoons. And so when the soils become wet, they swell. And then when they dry, they contract, making mud cracks. And that wet drying creates these really strong PED surfaces, which you see here. Then we have a little sand interval, which is actually full of microfossils. It's full of ostracods, which are these kind of sand grain size crustaceans. It's kind of like a little shrimp inside a little clamshell. And I love ostracods. They're some of my favorite organisms. And then on top of that, suddenly now it's laminated. And we're going to associate those laminations with a lake. So what we've just done then is gone from having a soil to a flooding surface to now a lake. And I'll highlight that flooding surface in red right here. So that's this transition between this package. And as you go up, you start to see, whoops, sorry, I made it mad. You start to see that we lose those laminations and it becomes scrambled once again. So this sequence of lam to scram continues on and on and on. And we interpret this to represent a low energy lake margin that's very dynamic. It's moving back and forth. So here's that sand, here's your fine grain laminated into maybe fine grain massive. And then ultimately, if we were to stack this on top, this P standing for paleosol, V standing for vertic structure, which is that strength swell process that I just described. And we can make a schematic model of this, right? We can visualize this as a cartoon in these time steps that I'll show here. So here is time 1. We have sediments depositing, being laminated on a lake floor. The water's going up, but the water starts to fall back down. And now we're going to expose that. We're going to form a soil with all of our little plants and roots and burrowing organisms, and it's exposed to the surface, so it's mud cracking and shrinking and swelling. And then ultimately that lake comes right back, depositing that layer of sand and then continuing on with a laminated sequence. So get this, when we looked at the outcrop, we saw about 33 examples of flooding surfaces, and we were like, whoa, that's like 400 meters of sediment. Like we've got a bunch of these, like 30 of them. When we looked at the core and I did that facies analysis, we realized, oh shoot, we like missed 100 of those. There's actually about 130 of these transitions, which is fascinating, because if we take that age model, if we take that rate, then we realize that these are occurring about every 5,000 years. They're super rapid. This lake is rising and falling and constantly in a state of flux. And we never would have had that opportunity to see that without these scientific drill cores. What we now realize is a lot of those kind of rusty layers that I pointed to in that outcrop photo, those are actually those little ostracod sands. And so those are actually those transgressive sands, or lake level rising flooding surface sands. And we previously just hadn't recognized what we were looking at. But now that we know that, we can apply it to other outcrops where we might have similar things. And the other thing that's really cool about this record is, again, here's that core plot, just kind of showing you the true colors and general grain size. And you notice that at the top third of this record, it goes from something that's very characterized by green sediments, lots of silt, to something that's characterized by these kind of like reddish brown. And what we're interpreting here is that we have a change from something that's more lakey to lake margin, right? So something that's much more dominated by reduced processes, low oxygen processes, hence that green color, to something that's more oxygenated, that's kind of characterized probably by something like a delta plane. And so we can actually map the types of environments that we're seeing in the paleo record 2 million years ago from this Paleolake Lorenyang onto modern Lake Turkana. And there are direct analogs for that. So here at the bottom, these kind of laminated intervals, these are the types of things we would expect to see in the open lake. Now the lake margin, which is over here, so that back and forth, sometimes wet, sometimes dry, we see in areas such as this depression right here, which is known as Sanderson's Gulf, that oftentimes seasonally will be connected to the lake. But during the time that this photo was taken, it's kind of an isolated wetland. So it's somewhat wet, but it will completely dry out at other times. And then the top of this core looks a lot like what we would expect to see in kind of a deltaic plain. So similar to the delta here with the modern Omo River that flows from the north into the south and enters Lake Turkana and actually sustains the lake as it is today. So we have this first order big scale transition in environment from lake to floodplain. So it appears to be a contraction of that lake. So the next question then becomes is this an environmental signal, or is this a climatic signal? i.e., did the climate get drier through time? And that's what we're tracking. Oh, and there you go. There's the boundary right there highlighted. So again, just to emphasize, we've got this first order transition at about 60 meters depth, which we see in grain size and color. And overall, we have something that's a very dynamic system with this sub-Milankovitch scale cyclicity, which also I'll emphasize is something that we can't get from the marine record. Those ocean cores, they're beautiful and they're consistent through time, but generally the sedimentation rates are so slow that something like 5,000 years is contained in like a millimeter. You can't see it. So by drilling on the continent, we now not only can tie more directly to our fossil sites, but we can see things at a different scale of resolution than previously we were able to. Which begs the question, climate change or environmental change? Maybe something changed about the tectonics. And again, coming back to my cereal bowl, maybe that cereal bowl was bigger or smaller than we thought. Maybe it was one of those camping bowls that's collapsible and it suddenly kind of collapsed a little bit. We don't know. And that's what we needed to address next. So integrating the sedimentology and the stratigraphy and the chronology with other proxy records allowed us to address this question. Here I'm showing some data from my collaborator Chad Yost and his colleague Stephen Rusina at the National Museum of Kenya. And okay, paleoclimatologists love wiggles. They love squiggly wiggly curves, and they're all about the wiggle curve. So bear with me and let me break this down a little bit. On this x-axis, you're going to see time. And again, they're transitioning using that age model that I showed you earlier. They're taking every single depth in the core and giving it an age. And then they're modeling what they would expect between the different samples that they have. On the y-axis of the next two slides, you're going to see a whole host of different axes. But what I want you to kind of look at are the kind of relationships between them. So up at the top here, this is solar insolation, and this is showing a very strong precessional signal. And solar insolation is really important for this study because the strength of the solar insolation, i.e. stronger solar insolation, leads to a stronger monsoon, so a stronger wet period in Eastern Africa. And we see this at kind of the most recent peak of this. We had a monsoon that was 17% stronger than what we see today. So the wet times get wetter. The dry times, though, often will stay dry, and that does not change. So here, again, you're seeing precessional cycles. These are these 20,000-year cycles, which again points to kind of the disconnect between the high resolution that we can get in this record and what previously was really the focus of paleoclimatic records. This next plot down is showing you pollen data. And one thing that was really interesting is the bottom of the core, pollen in that lakey part, pollen was great, but right where we hit that transition where we went into this more deltaic location, pollen drops off and we see almost nothing in the upper part of the core. However, there were other ways we could get at plant communities. And one of the great ones that we can use are phytoliths, which are these little silica components that plants build in their structures for stability and strength. And so coupling the pollen record here with the phytolith record, we have kind of one larger, more holistic picture of change in vegetation or lack thereof through time. And in this case, it's a lack thereof. Both the pollen and the phytoliths showed that we had mesic to xeric, so kind of moderate to dry adapted vegetation, grasses in particular, so much grass. So just grass through time, very little change in that grass, which was interesting. But we always like multiproxies, right? So we looked to some other things too. And now I'm showing a data set from my colleague Rachel Lupian. And again, we're seeing time on this x-axis. And now we're looking at compound-specific isotope records from leaf waxes. So the lipids that coat every leaf of every plant are what's being analyzed here. And you're seeing another solar curve. This time we're looking at eccentricity, this 40,000-year cycle. And when my colleague Rachel looked at these data, and you can look at these data too, right? There's some wiggles, there's some back and forth. There's actually a lot of variability. This record's characterized by a highly variable record. However, there's no statistically significant trend in terms of directionality. And in particular, this deuterium record's really important because this tracks rainfall and amount of rainfall in particular. And what you're seeing is that throughout this record, the amount of rainfall does not appear to be changing. So when we combine the kind of plant functional types with the records from rainfall, paleoprecipitation records, we can now test this hypothesis. So if we started out with the hypothesis of, okay, the bottom of this looks like a lake, the top of this looks like a floodplain, or a delta, then we must have gone from something that was very wet to something that was very dry, which was often kind of what was always interpreted. When we see lakes, it must be wet. When we look at the pollen and phytoliths, we see consistent grasses throughout. When we look at the biomarker record, we see no trend in terms of amount of rainfall. So what that means then is that we have to revisit this assumption that every time we see a lake in the geological record, it means that things were wet, and thus, genus Homo was living at a very wet time. And instead, what we're seeing is an environmental change, one from lake to river. that probably is related more towards tectonics, that change in the size of the bowl, as opposed to climate per se. Now, coming back to this kind of so what story, why does that matter that genus Homo is not necessarily living in an increasingly dry environment? This actually does tie to Darwin, and kind of as one of the first people to kind of toss out this idea of the savanna hypothesis, this idea that we became bipedal because we suddenly the woodlands were drying up and they were being replaced by grasslands, and we were more vulnerable in the grasslands, so we needed to have our hands in order to carry things between trees to then escape predation on these grasslands. And what we're coming to realize more and more is that it seems less like large-scale directional changes are what we as humans are contending with, and rather it's this variability. It's this Milankovitch to sub-Milankovitch variability, and the fact that we're really adaptable. We handle changes very well. We've all handled a lot of changes recently, thinking about, the 2020 and what it looked like to go from one day sitting in class with everybody around you to the next day being at home on a computer all the time, right? We are very good as a species at handling variability. And Turkana Boy then is living at a time that is very variable. We were actually able to find the ash layer that Turkana Boy is directly associated with in our core. It comes in right around here, so in that upper kind of deltaic part of the record. And underneath it is a soil, and actually, is a sand, and on top of it is a soil. And we found this soil. We can get those pedogenic carbonates. We can analyze the kind of signature of what this landscape looked like. And actually this irregular surface that you're seeing here, these were little hippo footprints. So the teeth of Turkana Boy were pooled in these hippo footprints. And so because we are able to tie right into this record, we can now say, we can sample this interval and we can look at 7-year intervals about the life of Turkana Boy, and we can actually map a record of environmental change directly onto this hominid fossil and the community that it was living in. Okay, so having a beautiful record like this of the Paleopleistocene is really exciting. But that record alone is maybe a little window into a larger time. And some of the things that are currently really captivating my interest is expanding this and looking back further in the past. As Sarah mentioned, we're both involved in this Turkana Miocene project, where we're now stepping back in time and we're trying to look at the very first primates that occupy this region. And here you see a diagram, and there's a lot going on here, which points to just the size of this team that we've assembled through the Turkana Miocene project and the complexity of the types of questions that we're seeking to answer. Here again, we have kind of 3 components of this, which are also represented in our project logo. The idea that we have a record of earth change, geologic change, a record of climate change, and then ultimately that's influencing the change in life. So these 3 spheres are intersecting. And so here you have the time scale right here. And now kind of, where before we were hanging out in this little blue box up here, now I'm really interested in this part. I want to know all about how primates came to be and how we get these organisms on this landscape and how they're adapted and evolving to this world around them. And the Miocene's really interesting because we actually see a large-scale global cooling trend throughout the Miocene. And we're getting the development of ice sheets kind of closer up into the Paleopleistocene, but overall we're really changing the global climate, and that change is causing significant environmental changes. What you're looking at here in this wax record is actually a change in the spread of C4 grasses. So pretty much every grass you see is a C4 grass. So it ties to this story of the fact that the land around us, the landscape around us in the continent of Africa is changing dramatically. And so stay tuned for more information. This project's in very early stages, but if you want to follow along with us, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we have a website, and it's a really great group of researchers from Kenya, from the US, and from a couple European countries as well. So stay tuned for exciting updates there. Here's everybody, right? There are a lot of people. So shout out to all of my colleagues, including Sarah. See here. All right, so here, the past is the key to the present. This principle of uniformitarianism underpins all of modern geology. This idea that we can use the past to understand the present. So I'd be remiss if I didn't also highlight some of the work that's been going on in recent timescales, because some of how fauna responds to changes in climate is really important to understand as we face a world that's shaped by climate change. And in these locations in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of times we don't have long-term instrument records of temperature. Even things like a temperature record, oftentimes they're 50 years long, which is not enough time for us to really look at large-scale trends. And also, when we look at things like the IPCC report, we see that sub-Saharan Africa is one of the locations in the world that has the most at stake when it comes to climate change. In terms of like the economic impact of that, it's very high. And the uncertainty of what's going to happen in a changing world is pretty low. We don't have a lot of confidence about how global climate change is going to impact these locations specifically. So then I'm always looking for ways to kind of connect lessons from the past into the present and hopefully ultimately informing the future. So I'm going to add this little red box and highlight some work that I've been doing in and around kind of modern, or probably what we would here refer to as historical time periods. And what you're now seeing right here is an axis of, or a plot of lake levels through time. So on the x-axis, we have time, with this end being the youngest and this being the oldest. And you're looking at lake level changes through time. And this is satellite-derived data. So satellites are always flying over, and they're measuring the elevation of the lake. And what we see is that through time, Lake Turkana is characterized by very dynamic annual fluctuations, and that's tied to the annual monsoon that we see. Generally, there's a peak in wetness that comes right after the long rains in April to May, and then throughout the rest of the year, the lake is falling. However, when we look at kind of what recent trends are doing, we're maybe counterintuitively seeing a very rapid rise in lake level. The lake is going up and up and up to heights that are kind of haven't been seen since the 50s and 60s in this location. And this is actually something that we're seeing across many sites in Eastern Africa. So that, in many ways, oftentimes I think, oh, okay, higher lakes, fresher water, like everything's fine and dandy, like ecologically, we're good. Like, this is great, great news. However, I've done a bit of work looking at this location, which is known as Ferguson's Gulf. And it's located again on the western side of Turkana here. And it's a really shallow embayment that is a key breeding ground for fish. And so, again, fish are a huge resource in this location that's traditionally very dominated by pastoralism. Currently, it's in massive amounts of drought, though. So people's livestock are dying, potentially like 90% of livestock die off. Really catastrophic time for this location. And unfortunately, from these cores that I took in 2011, so again, this is before that really rapid rise really initiated. But what I'm seeing in these records, and again, these are from ostracods right here, so two critters in particular highlighted here, but across all ostracod taxa. And these ostracods are benthic. They're often underpinning the food chain that's on top of them, and they're good ecological indicators. But we're seeing just catastrophic loss of biodiversity in this really important fish breeding ground. And so, that begs the question, obviously, why? And a lot of this is probably due to overfishing and human impacts in the region, mismanagement of fisheries, poaching, and then also potentially waste runoff from the surrounding areas. So there's real cause for concern. This basin has been in this location accumulating sediments since, about 17 million years. And today we're seeing things that are really unprecedented. And so part of that is due to the need for resources, both hydroelectricity. There are a number of dams that are being built along this Omo River, which you'll notice the border between Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia occurs right at the top of this lake. So here you have a natural ecosystem that now is spanning two different countries, three different countries, but really two that are kind of fighting over who gets what water. Very similar to what we're all witnessing happening in the Western US right now with water rights in the Colorado River. And so kind of the push for hydroelectric power, the push to maintain high qualities of life for people in the large cities is then directly juxtaposed with the ecological health of places, remote places such as Lake Turkana. And so if we think about kind of the impacts of climate change, it's pretty easy to think about them having just seen those data and to have concern for Lake Turkana, but it's much larger than that, right? Climate change is going to impact us on every level, from kind of the ecosystems that we're used to being around and that we are so and passionate about preserving. Think the charismatic megafauna, right? To the agriculture, what we're growing, where our food is coming from, right? All of these are impacted by climate change. To the places we live, the cities that are removed oftentimes seemingly from the natural world, but we know can often be highly vulnerable. And all of these examples I've shown are examples from Kenya specifically, but we realize that, closer to home, we also have these issues. We also live in areas that are vulnerable to climate change. And so ultimately, the changes that we're seeing in the modern, are at a much more rapid rate than what we've seen in terms of changes in the past. And so we've kind of come to this really important juncture where now physical evolution, like us changing different parts of our bodies through this slow evolutionary process, is no longer going to be sufficient. And we need to really take action and change more rapidly through cultural evolution in order to respond to things such as the climate crisis. So hopefully I've kind of come full circle and made a compelling case for why we're interested in changes in the past and ultimately how that directly impacts us today. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, including how long did it take to get this Land Rover out of the sand? And thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, that was an excellent thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fred.
I'm curious, are there any outflows to the lake? So it's not a closed basin.
No.
So it becomes a lot more complicated.
There are outflows. So the question was, are there outflows from the lake? And the answer is no, it's a closed basin lake. So the only way water is getting into that basin is either through direct rainfall, which, spoiler, there's only about 200 millimeters of rainfall, if even that, in this location. It's extremely dry. And then the Omo River brings in anywhere from 80 to 90% of the water that's in that lake. So cutting off the Omo, changing anything in the watershed of the Omo is going to have direct impacts to the health and sustainability of Lake Turkana. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk, Dr. Beck. I'm monitoring the online questions, and we have about 150 people watching online.
Wow.
If you could also repeat the question, because they actually can only barely hear me. The first question is from Canada, someone who's come to the festival quite often, and he asks, did you find in preparing for your expedition and during it that there was any resistance, be it political or religious, from local communities?
Yeah, great. So the question was about kind of the logistics involved with conducting work in the Turkana Basin. And one of the things that's really important to me and the teams I work with is having meaningful two-way exchanges in terms of our interaction with the communities in this location, because obviously they're the ones who both stand to kind of gain from the finds that we make and the science that we develop, but also are potentially vulnerable, because if we just come in and take drill cores and then go back to the States, right? Like, what are they actually benefiting from the resources that they provided? And so I've been working very closely with the Turkana Basin Institute, which is an NGO based in Kenya, and headquartered both in Nairobi, but also with a couple of offices in Turkana itself. And that's been a really great way, because me sitting in my office at Hamilton College, I don't necessarily know what the greatest needs are for the communities. So by partnering with organizations that do have that knowledge, I'm able to oftentimes interface directly with the local communities. A lot of times jobs are really important. So we're making sure that we're hiring local people to be involved in our science. And then also working with the Turkana Basin Institute and programs that they've developed, including a really cool master's project that's actually, or sorry, a master's program that's facilitated in Lodwar, which is the capital city of Turkana County. So enabling us to train and to work with Kenyan scientists and to integrate them into our work without having to take people out of country, to create more open access and ease of access for the next generation of scientists, which hopefully will be shaped and driven by a lot of Kenyan colleagues.
Dr. Beck, I have another online question and also a request from our tech team at the back.
Yeah.
In your answer, could you go closer to the microphone?
Oh, this microphone?
I think
Okay,
so, yeah.
I got it.
So the question is, in your view, how much, let me just reread the question. How much progress do you think the United States has made in terms of climate change?
Oh, what a good question. Whew, do we have all day? Okay, I guess I would say that I try to remain optimistic, and that any action we take is good action. I was really struck as I drove here by the number of solar panels along the Mass Pike, and just being like, oh, this is really different than when I went to school here. And so I'm encouraged by that. I think anytime the price of oil goes up, we're ripe to make a push for kind of decarbon future. I do worry about things like, you know, a lot of resources that go into your EVs, right? All your batteries, they're being unsustainably and unethically mined in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I recognize that the issue is really complex, but I think that I certainly see more will and more desire to make changes than I have at any other point, which makes me hopeful and makes me keep hoping for a better world for myself, my kids, all of us to live in. So I guess I think there's a lot to be done, but if we think of it as like, here's where we need to get to, it's so daunting that we're probably all going to just shut down and like curl up with a book under a blanket and just be like, I'm going to ignore it. So any little step we take is a benefit and is a positive.
I don't want to monopolize the questions, but we do have a few more online, unless anyone in the audience has. Well, the next question online is, you showed us right towards the end of the talk, the rising lake levels. And the question is this possibly due to dams, hydropower?
It's a great question. We don't know. That's kind of one of the scary parts of it, is like, we don't really have very open access to what exactly is going on. Back when I took those cores in 2011, I was really worried about drawdown on the lake due to filling of the reservoirs behind those dams, because it's a series of at least 5 dams, but I think ultimately they want 7 of them. So it's a huge kind of cascade of dams. And if you have to fill each and every one of those reservoirs, then you're locking a ton of water up in Ethiopia and not letting it flow through to Kenya. I'm also worried about sedimentation, right? If you put a dam in a water like that looks like chocolate milk, which is what the Oma looks like. I was just there in December, and it's spectacular. But if you put a dam in there, then less sediment's going to flow down there, and it dramatically changes the river. And again, drawing on kind of parallels with the Colorado River, we see that in areas they've actually had to go in and replenish areas of the river with sediment, because when you shut off the natural sediment that should be flowing through the system, you damage kind of fringe like ecosystem habitat niches. So the short answer is we don't know if that increase in water is just due to the dams, but we see it on other rivers that are not dammed. And so it does actually seem to be some kind of real signal of increased lake levels. I've also heard potentially that increase in lake level, it's just kind of, we don't have great data on this. This is something that would be really interesting to explore, but it actually seems like areas around Turkana are a little bit cloudier than they've been in the past, even though they're not receiving rainfall. And so is there some effect of clouds reducing the evaporation off the lake and causing the lake level to rise? We don't have enough data to test, or we don't have enough data in hand to say one way or the other, but that would be something I would love to test.
I think the last question online, and then we've probably got time for maybe one more in the audience, is I'm sure you prepare for this when you're making the drilling of the cores in terms of damaging, the potential for damage to heritage and archaeological sites. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we went out to do that drilling, everything had been preceded by site surveys that included people from the National Museum of Kenya, who is another kind of partner that we work with regularly in this location. And so we chose the sites so that we were avoiding any active archaeological excavation and kind of prospecting for like, all right, let's find a surface that doesn't have any tools associated with it. Let's use one single road so that we're not kind of leaving tire tracks all over. And then kind of let's make sure that we have the people who have been working on the archaeological and geological records in this location involved in that planning process and as part of our teams, which we were able to kind of recruit and retain those people within our project, which really helped us feel very confident that we were not having any kind of substantial impact on the archaeology and paleoanthropology. Although we all we're kind of crossing fingers, like maybe we'll just drill through a hominid, like maybe we'll just bring up a split a core and there's a hominid in it. But we didn't find any hominids. We didn't find any tools in there. We found a lot of silt. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.